Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Perception 6.30 in the new Gen Series 1 KV module. Your microphone will stay muted throughout the presentation in order to avoid feedback. If you have any questions, we will address them at the completion of the presentation using the Q&A feature of WebEx. However, you're welcome to type in questions at any time in the chat box. Our presenter this afternoon is Krista Tweed. Krista is an applications engineer for HBM based in Madison, Wisconsin. Krista has been with HBM for 13 years and has been supporting Perception, the Gen Series hardware, since they were initially released. And without further ado, to get things started, I'll now hand this over to you, Krista.
Thank you very much, Tina. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to spend a little bit of time just going over some of the new features of Perception 6.30 and giving a brief introduction to the new Gen Series 1 KV module. A few of the items that we'll cover today are the new time-based grouping approach in Perception, the sensor database options, an opportunity for local storage using the iSCSI protocol, a new function creator, some new cycle mask functions, and then kind of some miscellaneous features that have been added just to the Gen 2i instrument panel interface and miscellaneous features that didn't fit into other categories. Time-based grouping. This is a new feature of Perception. If the mainframe that you use with Perception has modules that have different maximum sample rates, what's going to happen when you first connect with Perception 6.30, if you do an auto configure, is that Perception is going to automatically put all modules that have the same maximum sample rate into a group together. So if your module has all 1 megasample modules, if your mainframe has all 1 megasample modules, you're not going to notice anything different than usual. But if you have one high-speed module with a maximum sample rate of 25 megasamples a second, and then a group of 1 megasample modules that do some signal conditioning, you may notice this as you connect and have Perception auto configure. The reason we've done this is to give a better overview for larger installations, and it also corrected some problems that have been occurring with modules that had different sample rate capabilities being in the same group. You do have the option when you go into the settings sheet to rename those groups for a better overview. So you can see in the example screenshots I've placed here that this user renamed the groups left wing, right wing, landing gear, etc. This does make it easier to set up the sample rate information because you can do that at the group level and you know all those modules in that group are the same. There's a new option now with Perception, and this is something that users have been asking us for a long time, which is a sensor database. Advantages of a sensor database are really to make setup of channels in Perception very, very simple when you have sensors or probes connected. If you have this option active on your Perception license, there's 2 new items that you'll see when you start Perception. One is that there's a sensor database sheet, meaning that's a tab shows up at the top edge of the Perception screen that'll say sensor database. There's also a sensor database navigator, and the navigators are those tabs that show up on the left side of the Perception screen. When you mouse over them, they slide out. So there's a new one called sensors for the navigators as well. This option is included in Perception Enterprise and Professional licenses, and it's a cost option for all other Perception licenses. So how does it work exactly? There's 2 different ways if you have a sensor set up in your database that you can tell Perception you want to use that sensor with a specific channel. One, in the screenshot I've shown below, you can see that the sensor navigator is open at the bottom of the screen. You can just browse to that sensor in the sensor navigator and then click and drag and drop it on top of the channel that you want to use it on. That's the first option. The second option is that you can use the sensor column in the settings sheet tab of Perception. So you'll see there's a new column called sensor. Next to the channel you want to set up, you just click in that column, and what it's going to show you is all of the sensors in the sensor database that are compatible with that channel. You can select the one you want, and Perception's going to automatically populate all the columns in the rest of the settings sheet with the information for that sensor. When you you have the sensor database options, there's actually two different sensors, or sensor databases that are there. One is the HBM sensor database, and this one, when you look at the sensors in it, are all going to have the locked icon like you see below. That's because that database cannot be edited. It just gives you some sample sensors, and you can use those as a basis to build your own, and this database is going to be overwritten each time perception is updated. If you actually want to personalize the sensor database, you'll use a user sensor database. And in that one, you can set up all your own sensors, the information is saved, and it will not be overwritten when perception is updated. As I said, the HBM database contains information on voltage probes and current clamps that we sell, as well as a variety of strain gauge-based sensors. When you configure a sensor for your own use, you can enter a channel name and a sensor name that then will get copied over to the perception settings when you select that sensor. You're also going to see a reminder in the database to actually use the information off the individual calibration sheet for a sensor. What that means is, let's say you purchase an IEPE accelerometer, and the standard, what's quoted on the standard specification sheet is 2 millivolts per G. When you actually receive that sensor, it'll have a calibration sheet that tells you maybe the sensitivity for that specific accelerometer is 1.98 millivolts per G. So that reminder is just to tell you you're going to get better results if you'll use the specific information for the sensor you're using. The sensor database allows you to maintain and add sensors. You can upload an image into the sensor database to remind you what that sensor looks like. You can see a graph of the linearization curve based on the sensor information that you've entered. And in the advanced settings section, which you can reach by clicking on this arrow, you can also enter calibration dates and have perception remind you if a sensor is out of calibration. There's a new option with Perception 6.30 for iSCSI storage. If we take a step back first and just think about the different storage options that are available. The first is to store to the PC running perception. This is the easiest setup. There's no accessories or options required. You just use the standard 1 gigabit Ethernet connection that's part of every Gen Series mainframe. There's also a second option, and this one's been available, I believe, since January of 2012. It does require the Interface 2 module be a part of that mainframe, and all mainframes that shipped after January 1st, 2012 include an IM2, and that's to have a local hard drive actually installed as part of the IM2. Here in this picture you can see a side view and the hard drive is there. That gives you local storage inside your Gen Series mainframe. You can get a continuous throughput rate of 50 megabits per second with that internal drive, with the caveat that when you store data locally rather than through your PC in Perception, you will not have Workbench or hardware setup information stored as part of the PNRF file. The new third option is to have local storage using the iSCSI protocol. The advantage of this type of local storage is that the disk can be far away from the Gen Series mainframe, but still have a direct connection to that mainframe. Typical throughput rates are 40 megabytes per second, continuous storage rate, assuming appropriate NAS server. The testing that we did was with a Synology DS212 and RS3412. And again, because this is local storage and not through the PC running Perception, you will not have any Workbench information as part of the PNRF file. This iSCSI option replaces the SCSI option that was offered with the IM1 module. If you have an older mainframe and are interested in being able to support an iSCSI storage, it is possible to upgrade those mainframes that were manufactured before January 1st of 2012 to an IM2 module. And you can just contact your salesman and ask about that. The benefit of this iSCSI storage is really that you can store data without having Windows involved. And for some of our customers, that's very attractive. So what does it look like in Perception? There's a new option in the Settings menu, which is called External Storage Setup, and it opens this dialog that's shown here. You just select the check mark, Enable External Storage, and then you can enter in the iSCSI information. You will have to format the drive the first time that you're connecting to it, but once it's formatted, it will appear in the Settings sheet in Perception under Storage Location. So you can select whether you're using PC storage, iSCSI, or another option. The function creator. We've had users asking us for a long time to have some error checking within the formula database option in Perception, because it was pretty easy to forget a semicolon or a period and then not have your formula work. Well, this function creator essentially adds that error checking and makes it much easier to configure a formula in the formula database. So there's an icon that you click that will open this function creator, which is shown here. You type in your function name. This is the name you give it. You'll select the function you want to use. You can enter units if you need it. The rows with the red background are required. The rows with the blue background are optional. And you'll see you have a preview button at the bottom, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So you're going to fill in, just use the data sources icon here to open and select the channel that you want to use, type in information for a number of samples, etc. And Perception is going to automatically write that formula for you using all the right syntax. There's two ways that you can find a function in that middle part of the function creator. One is just to click on the drop-down menu. It's going to list all the groups of functions. You can select the one you're interested in and see all the options in that group. The other is you can just start typing a name. So if you know the name of your function, you can type it in and Perception will automatically search for that name. The preview at the bottom will give you a quick overview of what the results of that function is going to look like. If the result is a waveform, you'll see a small graph. If the result is an integer, a number, then you'll see that appear in a meter. And it gives you a quick way to just verify that your formula seems to be working. Psychomath. We've also added a whole new group of functions that we call the psychomath functions that are all based on newly developed zero-crossing detection algorithms. For some applications, if they are looking for RMS or frequency of a cyclical signal, it's very important that they only make those measurements on an even number of cycles or a half number of cycles and not 3/4 of a cycle or a third of a cycle. And previously, it took a lot of work to build that up in Perception. So these cycle functions just add this whole list here shown of all the different possibilities that you can do on a cyclical type signal. And all of these functions are described in the updated analysis manual. So if you install Perception 6.30, you may or may not be aware that the current version of manuals are always installed on your PC along with the software. You can find those by going to the Start menu of Windows and choosing HVM Perception Manuals. Select the language you want, English or otherwise, and you'll get a Windows folder that has all the Perception manuals in it. We've also added several features to the Gen2i instrument panel software. For people that may not know, when we released the Gen2i mainframe as part of the Gen series family, there was also a new version of Perception that supported the touchscreen interface of the Gen2i. So it's a simplified user interface that is touchscreen friendly. And there have been a few things added specifically to this version of Perception. One is a comment field. You can see in the picture on the right that you can display the comment field on the actual Gen2i screen and type in whatever comments you have. That comment will be included in the report that you print, and it's also saved as part of the PNRF file. This is very similar for users that might have had a Nicolay Vision to the comment field in the Nicolay Vision. You also have the option to save the setup into the current recording. So if after you've recorded data, you type in a comment that you actually want to be a part of that PNRF file that's already been saved, you can go to Save Setup and choose the option Save into Current Recording. And then it will actually save that comment you've just typed into that data that was previously saved. Remote control option. We had a few users wondering if it was possible to have kind of either remote or local control of a Gen 2i. And that is possible if you have an IM2 in your mainframe. And that's because the IM2 actually has two different Ethernet or Internet type connections. So what you would do is use the standard RJ45 interface as it's shipped from the factory, meaning connected from the internal PC in the Gen 2i to the internal Gen 2i hardware. And then you would use the optical Ethernet option on that IM2 to connect to your remote PC. You're going to have to purchase a perception license for that remote PC, but then you're going to choose one or the other. You can either connect to the Gen 2i hardware from the internal PC or using that remote PC, but you can't do both at the same time. We've added some new language to perception, so if you have colleagues in other countries, you have the option and they're running perception, they can do so in a local language. We've also added a 0 button on a pretty high level in perception to make it much easier to access balancing a bridge sensor that's connected to your channel. So if you set up that 0 balance is enabled for specific channels, you can then use the icon in the toolbar to make that possible. We've also added TED support for the 1632 channel module. So if you own the higher speed version of that module with the maximum sample rate of 250 kilosamples per second, then you can enable in the perception settings sheet to auto-detect TEDs on a channel. In that module, perception will detect when the sensor is connected, and it will automatically fill in the sensor information into the perception settings sheet. As a customer request, we had someone who needed elliptic and bandpass filters, so those have been added to the 1632 channel modules and will be included in future modules as well. We've also added a hardware diagnostic sheet. This gives an instant overview of the status of your system. So if you're getting some kind of warning from perception of an over temperature or some message like that, you could go to this diagnostic status sheet and look, and you're going to see fan speeds and system temperatures and have an easy way to view if everything looks okay. If there are problems, you'll see there's 3 different little squares. They'll either be green, yellow, or red, depending on if everything is good or you got a warning or a real problem. If you use our CSI or other remote control, CSI is custom software interface. So if you've created your own program to add features to perception or have a different user interface, or you like to control your Gen Series hardware remotely and not through perception, you may see some changes that have been caused by that new time-based grouping concept. So I'd encourage you to go and check out the documentation on that. You will get warnings of functions that are obsolete, but before you upgrade, you should be aware those changes are there. With an IM2, you actually have an option of having multiple Ethernet connections on a single mainframe. So we've added a new menu item in the settings menu called Mainframe Network Setup that makes it easier to set up these multiple internet connections. So if you're looking for where some of that went, it just moves to a new dialog. We also had a user request that some people set up extensive user tables within their software so that they can get instant feedback during their while their experiments running on formula results or things like that, but they didn't necessarily want that entire user table to be a part of their final report. And so now when you go to the properties of a table within the report sheet in perception, you have the option to only print a subset of that user table in your report rather than the entire user table. Some people have data, older data that they have from either other instruments or even just old hardware that they're interested in bringing into Perception and comparing to their new data from their Gen Series hardware. And previously there was a read ASCII file in the formula database, but it was pretty restrictive as far as the format of what that ASCII file had to be for Perception to read it. We now have two new import formats, both ASCII and CSV, and they're an option in the load recording dialog. So when you go to File, Load Recording, and down in the Files of Type, you click on that drop-down menu, you're going to see there's two new options, both ASCII recording files and the CSV recording files. And the new appendix has been added to the updated Perception manual that describes those file formats in detail. You'll also notice that the control panel looks a little bit different the first time you start Perception. We've made the icons consistent with the Gen 2i instrument panel interface. So these preview, record, stop icons now match the instrument panel. And we've also added a throughput gas gauge. Previously, the memory gauge, if you were running a sweeps recording, would help you monitor how the memory on your cards were doing if you were trying to record too much data more quickly than Perception could handle. And the disk gas gauge gives you information on your hard drive where you're storing data. This gas gauge will give you information if you're doing a continuous streaming of data, if you're running a continuous acquisition, just to make sure that you're not pushing the system too far and risking losing some data. The user interface selections. Previously, you could only easily run the Gen 2i instrument panel interface when you were connected to Gen 2i hardware. But you now have the option, if you go to File Preferences and select Startup, to be able to run that instrument panel interface even if you're using a Gen 5i, a Gen 7T, or a Gen 16T. We'll now move on to the new Gen Series 1KV module. There's two different versions. The GN610 has a 2 megasample per second maximum sample rate, and the GN611 has a 200 kilosample per second maximum sample rate. What we need to go over first is just to be aware that because of the high voltage capability, has a maximum input of plus or minus 1,000 volts, you do have to be aware of several safety considerations. One is that we recommend that that module only be used and connected by people that have proper training to work with those type of signals. You also need to be aware that be careful that you're using proper connectors and cables so that there's no danger. Whenever you have high voltages, to use plastic connectors rather than metal just keeps the operator safer. And you also need to be aware of the different measuring categories and where it's approved for use and not. So here's a picture just of mains voltage coming down our electric lines and coming into our house, and the different categories and ratings depending on what those voltage levels are. So they now call Cat 0, it was previously called Cat 1, if you're not directly connected to the mains at all. Cat 2 is if you are directly connected to low voltage mains, like a socket in your household, portable tools. Cat 3 is if you're actually connected to the distribution part of the low mains installation, something like circuit breaker, junction box, etc. And Cat 4 is you're really connected to the source of a low voltage main. This module has input spans. The smallest input span is plus minus 20 millivolts, and the largest is all the way up to plus minus 1,000 volts. At that highest range, there isn't an offset possible, so you can't set it from 0 to 2,000 volts. It really, highest input is minus 1,000 or plus 1,000. But obviously, you can handle a large range of signals with that large variety of ranges. They've got 4 millimeter safety banana plug inputs, 3 filter options of Bethel, Butterworth, or Elliptic, and you do have the option on the 2 megasample version of choosing an 18-bit resolution. That will make your resulting file size bigger because rather than 2 bytes per sample with 16 bits, you have 4 bytes per sample when you're in 18-bit mode. The isolation of the module, you've got 1,000 volt RMS from channel to chassis, 600 volt RMS isolation at Cat 2, and 300 volt RMS isolation at Cat 3. I will be sending everyone this presentation, so I'm not going to read all the nitty-gritty specifications to you. Typical maximum static error for the Gen series, you do have a 0.1% maximum static error, 0.1% of the full-scale range, and your noise is 0.02%. If you've got your 1 kV module in a Gen 2i mainframe, you do have some digital events and timer counter channels available. Both versions of the module, both the 2 megasample and the 200 kilosample versions, support 16 event inputs, so 16 digital channels. If you have the 2 megasample version and you run it in 18-bit mode, you will also have 2 timer counter inputs. And those are available to use through the digital I/O connector that's on the Gen 2i mainframe itself. There's some accessories with the module. You can get the BNC to banana adapter. You can get an artificial neutral box, and we've got some cables too. So we looked over today some new features in Perception 6.30. It is posted on the HBM website, and there's a link there. The maintenance in your Perception license must be current through November 1st of 2012 in order to install the software. If you're not sure when your maintenance expires, start Perception and go to Help About Perception, and it'll show you that information. The 1 kV module is expected to be released in December, but can be quoted now. So I appreciate your attention. Someone's asking about the IM2 module, and it is possible if you have an older mainframe that has an IM1 and you're interested in some of those features that are available with the IM2, there is an upgrade available. So you can, if you want to drop me an email, I can have your salesman send information on that. You do have to send the mainframe back to the factory to be upgraded.